Commander Vex-Thaal stared at the security monitor with the kind of expression reserved for discovering your breakfast had been replaced with battery acid. The massive Korthani warrior, all 8 feet of him, complete with razor-sharp claws and a jaw that could crack titanium, was currently experiencing what humans might call an existential crisis. "Repeat that again, Sub-Commander Quinn," he growled, his voice carrying the weight of someone who really hoped he'd misheard. Sub-Commander Quinn, a smaller but equally intimidating member of the Korthani species, cleared his throat nervously. His purple scales seemed to have lost their usual luster, which was never a good sign. "Sir, all 47 cubs from the nursery sector are gone." "Gone? Ah." Vex-Thaal's left eye twitched. "Gone as in vaporized? Gone as in abducted by space pirates? Or gone as in they've somehow managed to escape the most secure facility on this entire station?" "Well, sir." Quinn fidgeted with his claws, making tiny clicking sounds against his armor. "They're not exactly gone. Gone. They're relocated." The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Vex-Thaal slowly turned his massive head, and Quinn immediately wished he'd chosen a different career path. Maybe something safer, like bomb disposal or wrestling with solar flares. "Relocated," Vex-Thaal repeated slowly, each syllable dripping with the kind of menace that made grown warriors reconsider their life choices. "To where, exactly?" "The human quarters, sir. If the previous silence could have been weaponized, this one could have ended wars." Vex-Thaal's breathing became very deliberate, very controlled. It was the kind of breathing that preceded either meditation or mass destruction, and frankly, Quinn wasn't betting on meditation. "The human quarters," Vex-Thaal said finally. "Our cubs, our precious, irreplaceable offspring, are in the human quarters." "Yes, sir. The same humans we've been told are dangerous predators? Those would be the ones, sir. The humans with their unsettling binocular vision and their disturbing lack of natural weapons?" "Correct, sir." Vex-Thaal stood up, all 8 feet of him unfolding like some ancient monument to barely contained rage. "And how, pray tell, did our cubs end up in the lair of these allegedly dangerous predators?" Quinn consulted his tablet, though he clearly wished the information would magically change if he looked at it hard enough. "According to security footage, they wandered there on their own, sir. They wandered." "Yes, sir. 47 cubs. Just wandered into human territory." "It appears so, sir." Vex-Thaal closed his eyes and counted to 10 in Old Korthani. Then he counted to 20. Then he briefly considered the merits of early retirement and a nice quiet farm on some peaceful outer rim planet. "Show me the footage," he commanded. The main screen flickered to life, displaying the nursery sector in all its supposed high-security glory. Vex-Thaal watched as the cubs, each one about the size of a human child but covered in soft, downy scales, began their great exodus. They moved with the determined purpose that only young beings possessed when they decided something was more interesting than staying where they were supposed to be. "There," Quinn pointed at the screen. "Cub designation Pipnox appears to be leading the group." "Of course it's Pipnox," Vex-Thaal muttered. "That little troublemaker could find mischief in a meditation chamber." On screen, the cubs had reached the barrier between sectors. The barrier that was supposed to be impassable. The barrier that had cost the station 3 billion credits and had been designed by the finest military engineers in the galaxy. The cubs walked right through it. How? Vex-Thaal's voice had reached that dangerous quiet level that made seasoned warriors check their life insurance policies. "The humans, sir. They installed something called a pet door last week." Silence. The kind of silence that preceded supernovas. "A pet door." "Yes, sir. Apparently, they have small creatures called cats that needed access between sectors for recreational purposes. And nobody thought to mention that this pet door might be large enough for our cubs?" "Well, sir, the humans assured us their cats were much smaller than our cubs." "And?" "They were correct, sir. Their cats are smaller. But our cubs, it turns out, are very flexible." On screen, they watched as Pipnox demonstrated exactly how flexible contorting through the pet door with the kind of determination usually reserved for escaping from maximum security prisons. The other cubs followed, each one somehow managing to squeeze through the opening that should have been far too small. "Fantastic," Vex-Thaal said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just fantastic. So our cubs are now in human territory, presumably being, what? Eaten? Studied? Turned into some sort of human delicacy?" "Actually, sir," Quinn said hesitantly, "they appear to be sleeping." "Sleeping?" "Yes, sir. Very peacefully, from what we can observe." Vex-Thaal stared at his subordinate. "Show me." The screen switched to the human quarters, and what Vex-Thaal saw made his worldview perform several impressive backflips. The human residential area was nothing like he'd expected. Instead of the sterile, militaristic environment he'd imagined, it looked cozy. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and scattered throughout the various rooms were his cubs. All 47 of them. Fast asleep. Some were curled up on what appeared to be human furniture. Others had found soft fabrics and made little nests. A few were actually sleeping with the humans themselves, tiny scaled forms rising and falling with the steady breathing of their unlikely companions. "This island," Vex-Thaal started, then stopped. "This is not what I expected." "No, sir. The humans don't appear to be harming them. In fact what?" "Well, sir, it appears they're taking care of them. We've observed several humans bringing food, adjusting temperature controls, and even singing to them." "Singing?" "Yes, sir. Apparently, it's something humans do to help their young sleep. Our cubs seem to find it soothing." Vex-Thaal watched the screen, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. One of the humans, a female with long brown hair, was gently stroking the scales of a cub that had curled up next to her. The cub's purring was audible through the speakers. "They're purring," he said unnecessarily. "Yes, sir. Quite loudly, actually. The humans seem to enjoy it." Another human, this one male with graying hair, was carefully adjusting a blanket around 3 cubs who had formed a small pile on his couch. He moved with the careful precision of someone who really didn't want to wake sleeping children. "Sir?" Quinn ventured. "Should we retrieve them?" Vex-Thaal considered this. Protocol demanded immediate retrieval. The safety of the cubs was paramount. But looking at the peaceful scene on the screen, he found himself hesitating. "Have there been any signs of distress from the cubs?" "None whatsoever, sir. If anything, they appear more relaxed than they usually are in the nursery." "And the humans? Any indication they object to this invasion?" "Quite the opposite, sir. They appear to be enjoying it immensely. We've intercepted several communications where they refer to our cubs as adorable and the cutest things ever." Vex-Thaal felt a headache coming on. This was not covered in any military manual he'd ever read. How exactly did one handle a situation where one's supposedly vulnerable offspring had wandered into enemy territory and somehow turned it into a massive cuddle session? "Sir?" came a new voice. Vex-Thaal turned to see Lieutenant Zara Kess, his communications officer. "We're receiving a transmission from the human. Sector leader, Captain Murphy. Put it through." The screen split to show a middle-aged human with kind eyes and what appeared to be one of the cubs sleeping in his lap. The human was speaking in hushed tones, clearly trying not to disturb his tiny companion. "Commander Vex-Thaal, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. We seem to have some visitors, and I wanted to assure you they're perfectly safe. We're happy to have them, and they seem quite comfortable." Vex-Thaal stared at the human. Captain Murphy was supposed to be a dangerous predator, a member of a species that had fought its way to the stars through violence and cunning. Instead, he looked like someone's grandfather, gently scratching behind the cub's tiny scaled ears. "Captain Murphy," Vex-Thaal said carefully, "those are our young. Our cubs. Yes, I gathered that. Wonderful little ones, aren't they? This little guy," he gestured to the cub in his lap, "reminds me of my grandson. Same energy level anyway. They weren't supposed to be there." "Oh." I know. Quite the adventure they had getting here, from what I understand. That pet door was never designed for visitors quite this determined. Captain Murphy smiled. But they're welcome to stay as long as they like. My people are quite taken with them. Vex-Thaal found himself in completely uncharted territory. You're not. You don't intend to harm them? Captain Murphy's expression shifted to something that might have been offended, if it weren't so gentle. Harm them? Commander, look around. Do any of these cubs look harmed to you? Vex-Thaal looked. The cubs were sleeping peacefully, some even snoring softly. Several humans were moving around quietly, bringing what appeared to be food and water, adjusting environmental controls, and generally behaving like caregivers. I have to admit, Vex-Thaal said slowly, this is not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, that we'd find the remains. Captain Murphy's laugh was quiet but genuine. Commander, we have a saying here. It takes a village to raise a child. Apparently that applies to cubs as well. Your little ones are safe, well fed, and from the looks of it, happier than I've seen any children in quite some time. Vex-Thaal watched as one of the cubs stirred, opened sleepy eyes, saw the human nearby, and immediately curled closer with a contented sigh. This is highly irregular, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The best things usually are, Captain Murphy replied. Now, would you like to come over and check on them yourself? I think you'll find this situation rather illuminating. Vex-Thaal found himself nodding before his logical mind could object. Yes, I believe I would. Excellent. Fair warning though, you might want to bring some of your staff. We've got cubs scattered across 12 different residential units, and frankly, my people are getting a bit protective. Mrs. Henderson in Unit 7 has already declared that little Kixmore is staying for dinner. Kixmore? Vex-Thaal's parental instincts flared. That cub has dietary restrictions. He can't process standard proteins without. Relax, Commander. Mrs. Henderson used to run a xenobiology lab. She's already synthesized the proper enzymes. Your little one will be eating better than he has in weeks. Vex-Thaal stared at the screen, his worldview continuing its impressive acrobatic routine. A retired xenobiologist island. Cooking for my cub? Among other things, Dr. Patel in Unit 12 is monitoring the respiratory patterns of the 3 cubs sleeping in his quarters. Apparently he noticed their breathing was slightly irregular and wanted to make sure they weren't having altitude adjustment issues. Altitude adjustment? Vex-Thaal turned to Quinn, who was frantically consulting his medical databases. Sir, Quinn whispered urgently. The human quarters are on level 15. Our nursery is on level 3. There is a significant pressure, the differential that could affect young respiratory systems. And the humans noticed this before we did? It would appear so, sir. Captain Murphy continued, oblivious to the minor crisis he'd just caused in Korthani Command. Oh, and you'll probably want to speak with Lieutenant Garcia. She's set up what she calls a play area in the main common room. Apparently, some of your cubs woke up and were getting restless. The screen shifted to show another section of the human quarters, where a uniformed human female was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Surrounded by 6 very awake and very active cubs, she had somehow acquired what appeared to be various colorful objects that the cubs were batting at with obvious delight. Are those toys? Vex-Thaal asked weakly. Improvised ones, yes. Lieutenant Garcia has 3 children of her own back on Earth. She recognized the signs of bored youngsters immediately. One of the cubs, recognizable as the notorious troublemaker Nix Val, was attempting to climb onto Garcia's shoulders. Instead of being alarmed, she was laughing and gently redirecting the cub toward what appeared to be a makeshift climbing structure constructed from furniture. She's encouraging them to climb, Vex-Thaal observed, his voice carrying a note of amazement. Natural behavior for young ones, isn't it? Better they climb something safe than try to scale the walls. Vex-Thaal had to admit the human had a point. The nursery staff spent half their time trying to prevent the cubs from climbing everything in sight. This Garcia had simply accepted it as normal and provided appropriate outlets. Commander, Captain Murphy said gently, I think there might be some misconceptions on both sides about each other's species. Perhaps this situation, irregular as it may be, could serve as an opportunity for better understanding. Vex-Thaal looked at the screens showing his cubs happy, safe, and clearly thriving under human care. His military training screamed that this was all wrong, but everything he was seeing suggested otherwise. Very well, Vex-Thaal said, straightening his uniform with the kind of resignation usually reserved for walking into battle. Quinn, Zara Kess, you're with me. Let's go see what madness awaits us in human territory. The journey to the human quarters felt longer than usual, probably because Vex-Thaal's mind kept conjuring increasingly absurd scenarios. By the time they reached the sector boundary, he'd imagined everything from cubs wearing tiny human clothing to an elaborate cub-worshipping cult. Reality, as it turned out, was somehow both better and worse than his imagination. The moment they crossed into human territory, they were greeted by Sergeant Williams, a stocky human male who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years but somehow maintained the energy of someone running on pure caffeine and determination. Commander, perfect timing. We've got a slight situation developing in Recreation Area C. What kind of situation? Vex-Thaal asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Well, 3 of your cubs discovered our zero-gravity gymnasium. They're currently floating around having what I can only describe as the time of their lives, while Corporal Thompson tries to figure out how to get them down without causing a diplomatic incident. They hurried toward the recreation area, where the sound of delighted cub chirping could be heard echoing through the corridors. When they arrived, Vex-Thaal stopped dead in his tracks. 3 cubs were indeed floating in the zero-gravity chamber, performing aerial maneuvers that would have impressed veteran pilots. Their joyful sounds filled the space while a very nervous-looking human in exercise gear floated nearby, clearly trying to herd them like some sort of 3-dimensional sheepdog. They've been at it for 2 hours, Williams said proudly. Natural flyers, your little ones. Cubs aren't supposed to experience zero gravity until they're at least twice this age. Zara Kess whispered urgently. Really? Thompson. Kill the gravity. No, wait. Vex-Thaal called out. But it was too late. Gravity returned gradually, and the cubs descended slowly, landing with perfect grace on their feet. They immediately began chirping what Vex-Thaal recognized as requests to do it again. Huh, Williams observed. They landed better than most of my Marines on their first gravity drop. One of the cubs, a particularly adventurous one, named Yix-Tal, scampered over to Vex-Thaal and began climbing up his leg with obvious excitement, chattering about flying and fun and wonderful humans who let cubs do amazing things. They seem to have adapted remarkably well, Quinn observed, watching as Thompson was now being enthusiastically thanked by 3 cubs who had apparently decided he was their new best friend. That's nothing, Williams grinned. Wait until you see the mess hall. The mess hall scene defied every expectation Vex-Thaal had left. A dozen cubs were seated at specially lowered tables, eating what appeared to be nutritionally appropriate food while chatting with human diners. The humans were listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for fascinating lectures, despite the fact that they probably couldn't understand a word the cubs were saying. Private Deanna speaks a bit of Korthani, Williams explained, nodding toward a young woman who was apparently having a detailed conversation with Pipnox about the merits of different climbing techniques. She's been giving language lessons. Turns out, your cubs are fast learners. Fast learners proved to be an understatement. As they watched, several cubs began attempting basic human words, their pronunciation hilariously mangled, but their enthusiasm infectious. The humans responded by trying to mimic cub vocalizations, creating a cacophony of interspecies communication that somehow seemed to work perfectly. This is chaos, Vex-Thaal muttered, though. He couldn't quite keep the fondness out of his voice. This is family dinner, corrected an elderly human woman who had appeared beside them. She was carrying a cub who seemed to have adopted her as a personal transport vehicle. I'm Dr. Helen Foster, retired pediatrician. This little sweetheart is Kex Lum, and she's been helping me reorganize my medical supplies. Helping you? Quinn asked skeptically. Oh yes, excellent organizational skills. Better than my last 3 assistants, actually. Dr. Foster smiled as Kex Lum chirped proudly. She sorted my entire pharmaceutical cabinet by molecular composition. I don't know how she knew the classifications, but they were perfect. Vex-Thaal stared. Cubs don't learn molecular classification until advanced education phases. Well, this one apparently skipped ahead. Brilliant little thing. They moved through the human quarters like visitors to an alien zoo, except the roles were reversed. Every corner revealed new examples of interspecies cooperation that shouldn't have been possible. Cubs helping humans with tasks, humans adapting their living spaces for small visitors, and everywhere the sound of laughter and contentment. In the engineering section, they found Chief Petty Officer Reynolds showing a group of cubs how to calibrate sensor arrays. The cubs were not only following along but suggesting improvements that Reynolds was frantically scribbling down. Your little ones have an intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics that frankly puts our academy graduates to shame, Reynolds explained, looking slightly embarrassed. I've learned more about sensor optimization in 3 hours than I did in my entire engineering degree. Cubs aren't supposed to understand quantum mechanics, Zara Kess protested weakly. Tell that to little Vixnom over there. She just solved a calibration problem we've been working on for months. In the medical bay, Dr. Sarah Quinn was being assisted by 2 cubs who had apparently appointed themselves as her medical interns. They were organizing supplies with surgical precision while keeping up a running commentary on human physiology that had the doctor taking notes. Fascinating perspectives, Dr. Quinn explained. They see biological systems from completely different angles. Their insights into human cardiac rhythms alone could revolutionize our understanding of cardiovascular medicine. By the time they reached the main residential area, Vex-Thaal felt like he'd stepped into an alternate universe where everything he thought he knew about humans, cubs, and interspecies relations had been turned upside down and thoroughly scrambled. The residential area was the most shocking yet. Cubs had essentially integrated themselves into human family units. They were helping with cooking, though Vex-Thaal suspected the humans were doing most of the actual work. They were participating in what appeared to be family game night, with modified rules to accommodate different species. They were even tucked into human beds, sleeping peacefully beside their adopted families. Commander, Captain Murphy approached, still speaking in hushed tones. I hope you don't mind, but we've made some temporary adjustments to accommodate our guests. What kind of adjustments? Nothing major. Climate controls optimized for Korthani physiology, some furniture modifications for smaller users. Food synthesizers programmed with appropriate dietary requirements. Murphy paused. Oh, and we've established a communication protocol with your nursery staff. Apparently, this wasn't entirely unauthorized. Vex-Thaal's head snapped up. What do you mean? Well, it seems your head nursery supervisor, one Tlex Van, has been in communication with our childcare specialists for weeks. This, Murphy gestured around at the scene of interspecies domestic bliss, was apparently a planned cultural exchange program that got accelerated by enthusiastic participants. The silence that followed was different from Vex-Thaal's earlier silences. This one was filled with the dawning realization that he'd been outmaneuvered by his own nursery staff and a bunch of human caregivers. Tlex Van never mentioned, he began. Probably wanted to surprise you. From what I understand, both our species were curious about each other's child-rearing practices. The cubs just decided to take initiative. Quinn was frantically consulting his communications log. Sir, there are 17 messages from Tlex Van marked routine administrative updates that you classified as low priority. Vex-Thaal closed his eyes. Of course there are. The funny thing is, Murphy continued, this has worked out better than anyone expected. Your cubs are thriving, our people are learning incredible things about Korthani culture and intelligence, and everyone seems genuinely happy with the arrangement. So what happens now? Vex-Thaal asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Well, that's up to you. We're happy to continue hosting them for as long as you're comfortable with the arrangement. Though I should warn you, several of my people have started asking about adoption procedures. Vex-Thaal looked around at the scene. Cubs and humans working together, playing together, learning from each other. It was chaotic, unprecedented, and completely contrary to every protocol he'd ever learned. It was also obviously working. I suppose, he said slowly, we could consider this an extended cultural exchange program. Excellent. Murphy beamed. Though you should probably prepare yourself for the paperwork. Interspecies adoption requests are apparently quite complex. As if summoned by the mention of paperwork, Pipnock scampered over and began climbing Vex-Thaal's uniform, chattering excitedly about new friends and wonderful adventures and could they please stay just a little longer. Vex-Thaal looked down at the enthusiastic cub, then around at all the evidence of successful interspecies cooperation, then at Captain Murphy's hopeful expression. I think, he said finally, I'm going to need a bigger office. And possibly a human cultural liaison. This is going to require some very creative reporting. Murphy laughed. Welcome to the family, Commander. Before Vex-Thaal could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the human sector. Not the gentle chimes of routine announcements, but the harsh, urgent wails that meant genuine emergency. What now? Vex-Thaal groaned, his brief moment of peace evaporating like morning mist. Murphy was already moving toward the nearest communication panel, his relaxed demeanor shifting instantly to military alertness. Control. This is Murphy. Report. The voice that crackled through the speakers belonged to Lieutenant Brooks, and she sounded like someone trying very hard not to panic. Sir, we have a situation in Cargo Bay 7. Multiple breaches detected, and we're reading massive energy signatures approaching fast. Breaches? Murphy's face went pale. What kind of breaches? Hull integrity compromised in 17 locations, sir. Something punched through our outer defenses like they were made of tissue paper. Vex-Thaal felt his blood freeze. Whatever could breach human hull plating that easily was nothing they wanted to encounter with cubs scattered throughout the station. We need to evacuate the cubs immediately. Agreed. Murphy was already issuing orders. All human personnel, begin emergency protocols. Secure the youngsters and prepare for potential hostile contact. But as the adults sprang into action, something unexpected happened. The cubs, instead of being frightened by the alarms, began moving with purpose toward the source of the disturbance. Not running away, but toward the danger. No, 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 Vex-Thaal muttered, chasing after a group of cubs led by the irrepressible Pipnox. This is exactly why we don't let cubs wander around during emergencies. The group of cubs reached Cargo Bay 7 before the adults could stop them. What they found there made Vex-Thaal question everything he thought he understood about the universe. The hull breaches weren't caused by weapons or asteroids. They were perfectly round holes, each exactly the same size, arranged in a pattern that spoke of intelligence and purpose. And through those holes came visitors. More cubs. Dozens of them. But not Korthani cubs. These were Zelani young, recognizable by their crystalline exoskeletons and prismatic coloring. Behind them came Thraxan juveniles with their distinctive tentacle clusters, followed by what appeared to be baby Mordani with their soft, luminescent fur. Sweet, merciful stars, Quinn breathed, staring at the parade of alien youngsters streaming through the breaches. It's a nursery invasion. The various species of cubs immediately began interacting with each other, chattering in their different languages while the Korthani cubs served as impromptu tour guides, showing off their new human friends with obvious pride. How? Was all Vex-Thaal managed to say. Captain Murphy appeared beside them, looking like a man whose day had just taken a left turn into the impossible. My communications officer is reporting similar situations throughout the sector. Apparently, word has spread through the juvenile networks of at least 6 different species. Juvenile networks? Zara Kess asked weakly. You know how children always seem to know things before adults do? Apparently, that's a universal constant. The cubs have been communicating with their counterparts on other ships and stations. They decided this human cultural exchange program sounded too good to keep to themselves. Vex-Thaal watched as a small Thraxan juvenile attempted to communicate with Sergeant Williams using a combination of tentacle, gestures, and what sounded like interpretive squeaking. Williams, to his credit, was nodding seriously and responding with equally elaborate hand movements. "Sir," came another voice over the communications system. "We're receiving transmission requests from the Zelani mothership Bright Shard, the Thraxan exploration vessel Deep Current, and something called the Mordani family pod Soft Song. They're all asking about the status of their missing youngsters." "Missing youngsters who are currently," Murphy observed, watching as Dr. Foster attempted to organize what appeared to be an impromptu medical check for 3 different species simultaneously, integrating themselves into our community with impressive efficiency. A Zelani cub had discovered the zero-gravity gymnasium and was creating light patterns that had the other cubs mesmerized. The Thraxan juveniles were apparently natural engineers and had begun improving the human ventilation systems. The Mordani babies were curled up with human families, their soft glowing providing a natural nightlight that seemed to have a calming effect on everyone nearby. "This is getting out of hand," Vex-Thaal said, though his tone suggested he was past the point of actual concern and had moved into the realm of philosophical acceptance. "Getting?" Murphy laughed. "Commander, I think we passed out of hand about 3 species ago. We're now firmly in unprecedented interstellar incident territory." More alarms sounded, and this time the communications officer sounded like she'd given up on maintaining professional composure. "Sir, we have 7 more ships requesting docking permission. They're claiming their youngsters have gone missing and they've tracked them to our location." "How many youngsters are we talking about?" Murphy asked. "Current count is approaching 200, sir, representing 14 different species." Vex-Thaal closed his eyes and counted to 50 in Old Korthani. When he opened them, a small Aquani tadpole equivalent had somehow made its way out of the mobile water unit. One of the new ships had apparently delivered, and was now being carried around by a delighted human child in what appeared to be a specially designed portable aquarium. "I think," he said slowly, "we're going to need a bigger station." "Already on it," Murphy replied, consulting his tablet. "I've contacted Station Command about emergency expansion protocols. Apparently, this falls under something called the First Contact Childcare provision, which I didn't even know existed until 20 minutes ago." "There's a First Contact Childcare provision?" Apparently, someone in the bureaucracy was forward-thinking enough to consider the possibility that first contact might involve youngsters, though I doubt they imagined it would involve quite this many youngsters. A new group of cubs had discovered the human educational systems, and were apparently teaching themselves multiple languages simultaneously while helping human children with their homework. The scene was chaos, but it was organized chaos, with each species contributing their natural abilities to the collective effort of turning the human quarters into the galaxy's most diverse nursery. "Sir." Quinn appeared at Vex-Thaal's elbow, looking like someone who had accepted that reality was now optional. "I've been monitoring communications. It appears that this situation has attracted the attention of the Galactic Council's Department of Interspecies Relations." "Oh, wonderful. What do they want?" "They want to study this as a potential model for future diplomatic initiatives. Apparently, the rapid integration and cooperation we're witnessing here has never been documented on this scale." Vex-Thaal looked around at the controlled chaos. Cubs of different species were working together, playing together, and apparently solving problems that had stumped adult diplomats for decades. The humans had adapted to their role as universal caregivers with remarkable grace, and everyone seemed genuinely happy with the arrangement. "You know what?" he said finally. "Let them study it. Maybe they'll learn something." "What about protocols, sir?" "Quinn, at this point, I think the cubs have written their own protocols. And frankly, they seem to be working better than ours ever did." Murphy nodded approvingly. "I like your cubs, Commander. They think outside the box. They think outside the galaxy," Vex-Thaal corrected. "But apparently, that's exactly what we needed. And despite everything, despite all the protocols and procedures and military regulations that were currently being trampled underfoot by enthusiastic cubs and adopting humans, Vex-Thaal found himself smiling. After all, the best security alerts were the ones that ended with everyone safe, happy, and forming unlikely friendships across species lines. Even if it did mean rewriting the entire diplomatic manual and possibly inventing several new branches of interspecies relations theory.